Everybody to Design Factory and Facebook Live of Games Now lectures. I hope our audio is going in. Yep. It's going in. Good. So my name is Anna-Kaisa Kultima. I'm here to chair the next lecture on the Games Now lecture series. Today we have an international guest that is known for hardware indie game project that he's been creating for a few years now. So Robin Baumgarten, a developer living in London from Germany, is here to talk about his work. And also we will present his work in Helsinki tomorrow on a weird experimental pop-up exhibition on a beer tram. So that's another treat for Helsinki-based game enthusiasts. So yeah, that is the topic of today. Next week we will have a lecture again about using influencers in your game marketing. And but today, hardware, indie games, and Robin Baumgarten. So welcome.
Thanks. Hi everyone. All right, so I'm going to talk today to you about weird games I'm building, and they're all weird hardware experiments, and basically why I'm making them and how I'm making them and what can you actually do with them once you've made them. And especially the last part is kind of very experimental, just like the games basically, because it's learning by doing. So I have to figure out what I'm doing as well as I do it. But so far it's been quite fun and successful, so I'm going to share what I've done and who I am. So basically, that's me. I have a background in computer science and mathematics, a bit of AI as well, but none of it is engineering. So I didn't actually learn any of the hardware stuff in any formal way. And I used to do mobile games for a while until that was not feasible anymore. It's like in this market. So I kind of experimented around a bit with different things, and I landed on hardware games, which started as a hobby basically. And most of the things I show you at first are just hobby experiments like that I do in weekends, and then trying to show them to my friends and maybe to some exhibitions. And then later on, especially with Line Wobbler, which I'm also going to show and go into detail with, that kind of was my breakthrough, my aha moment basically, where I thought, okay, this is actually a thing I can do. But yeah, more on this later. So first I'm going to show you a couple videos mostly and things about what I made. So the first one is called A Dozen Sliders, which is a bit of a misnomer because I only made 8 of them because a dozen was too much. And they're basically motorized sliders. So like if you know these high-end DJ pults, they have these sliders in them that can move by themselves. And I decided, okay, this could maybe make a good controller. And here's a short video. It's a Vine, back when Vine was still alive, so it's just like tiny. But you can see they move by themselves, and they're also metal on the top. That's because they're touch sensitive, so if you touch them, they behave differently from when you don't touch them. And I made a couple mini games for that, but none of those mini games were really that great. I think that's also why I just said, okay, this is an experiment, now to the next experiment. So, but this one, the one I made, I don't know if I can show this video again. Yes, you can, well, you can't really see it, but in the background there is a version of Flappy Bird, basically, where you control the pipes instead of the bird. So the bird goes automatic, and each of those sliders is controlling a pipe. So yeah, I don't know if you can kind of see it in the monitor there. Yeah, it was a simple game, but it showed the game the sliders very well, because when you don't touch them, the AI plays the game, and so it's always better than you. So it's a kind of a little comment on how bad people are at playing games. And it shows the score as well. So the AI has like 200, and then people just get to 10 maybe. So it's quite fun. Next one, this is from this year's global game jam, I made a game with a weird sensor, which is a rubber band. And the rubber band, it has a varying resistance depending on when you pull it. So if you pull it, it changes resistance. You can measure the resistance. And I put the whole thing into Unity, so you can see the Unity interface in the background. And in Unity, it's just running a little physics animation. So it's basically spring joints and gravity. So it's not really a game either. It's just a small experiment. And that was very interesting also because it did fairly well on Twitter. It's like a couple thousand retweets, I think. But the game itself is actually kind of terrible. So it's like this separation between what works well on Twitter and what the game is like. Because I mean, I played it in a way that it looks really nice. But then when I showed it to people, everyone tried to do this, like lifting it up, right? Because that's what you want to do with these little guys. You want to throw them in the air. But obviously, there's no sensor or nothing to measure that. So I could add more sensors, like some accelerometer or something, or something else to measure that as well. But then the simplicity of the whole thing gets lost. And also, when I show it, the rubber band is actually fairly fragile, so you can easily break it. So if a kid plays it, it doesn't know it has to be careful. So I need to have some kind of safety string to maximize the tension. And that also takes away from the simplicity. So that was a nice experiment, but it didn't translate into a good game. The next one is a weird experiment without a screen. It's called Schroders Litter Box, and it's about finding and petting an invisible cat. So you can see there's like a touch panel, which is a touch screen without a screen, basically. And there's a glove we built. It's a vibration glove, so we put some vibration motors in it. And the LEDs are just visualization for viewers. But basically, when it blinks, it vibrates. And so you have to find the right spot. And when you find it somewhere up there, yep, then you found the cat and you pet it. It's a very simple little thing, but it's kind of weird, unusual thing. And we made it on a train. We made it on the train jam going, through California, basically, or all the way through America, really. But that was fun, and it's using tiny Arduino. This is the one. I'm going to talk more about those later. You can see the vibration motors there. And then there is the touch panel, maybe? Oh, yeah. Is this vibration? Is not me, right? And yeah, there's like this touch panel, and you can see it lights up when you touch it. It goes beep. Yeah. All right. This one is a bit more risky. We put a knife on a motor, and you have to press the buttons as long as you can. It's a cooperative game for 3 players, and there's a bar that fills up. You can barely see it on the screen there. And it fills up only if you keep at least 2 buttons pressed, and then it slowly depletes if you don't. The knife is also touch sensitive, so if it notices a player, it kind of goes back and forth really fast trying to cut you. Like this. Yeah, you can see the bar. And the further the levels go, the more erratic the knife gets. So at first it's like nice back and forth, and later on it does that little kind of feints. So it just pretends to move in some way. The knife is a French kitchen knife from a friend. We made it with 4 people. He took it from his cupboard. But it turns out, luckily for us, it's not very sharp. I could also say, no, we tested it carefully, but in the end, nobody was hurt. And also, the motor is very weak, and it breaks very often because we kind of stretch it out of its normal use. So, is this vibration? Is not me, right? The humming?
No, it's me.
Okay. Oh, yeah, so I can just show this again. So the motor is very weak, so it breaks, but it also nobody gets hurt. So I've shown it actually at a big expo in London, at the EGX expo in the tobacco docks. But I think it flew under the radar there, so we didn't fill out any health and safety sheets, and we didn't have our players sign any waivers. But you never know, so I don't know if I want to show this game at a lot of places. But it's definitely an interesting experiment, because also, especially for you guys now, you don't know if it's dangerous or not, right? So this playing with this expectation of fear or the expectation of pain is very interesting and hasn't really been done much. There's a pain station, which you might know, which is a similar, a different concept, but also plays with punishing players physically if they do badly. But that was kind of cool. Then recently, about 2 months ago, I started a new game that was the follow-up of Line Wobbler, which I'm going to go into detail later, so it's slightly out of order, is a game with a lot of door stopper springs. So you can see them there, and each of them has a sensor in them, and I'm experimenting with different games on them. So this is like a football game in a way, so you see this ball going, and you can kind of flick it away. But you can also see like the LEDs are very roughly laid out, and it's in a grid. So that was prototype 1. And prototype 2 looks like this. So it's in a hex grid and has like little LED rings. The idea of this one is like it's a kind of a fish pond in a way. So like there's a little red fish going around, and you kind of twang the springs to attract them. But this is like a very early prototype. I also have it here, but it's not set up right now. So we might show it tomorrow at the tram, or maybe later after the session if you guys are interested. But it's also interesting because I have the hardware, the prototype now, but I don't have a game for it yet. So I'm kind of experimenting with it as a new platform, and have to find out what I'm going to do with this. Right. Okay, as a brief interlude, hardware games are very hot right now, especially if you hold the soldering iron wrong. They're super hot. But it's also easier than ever to get started in this stuff. There is a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are it's easier to use the hardware, so some of them don't even require any programming. So I don't know if you know the Makey Makey. It's basically a touch-sensitive gamepad, basically, which you can wire up to like a banana, for example, and then you can touch the banana, and it triggers a key press in the computer. So it acts as a virtual keyboard. So it's very easy to get started with like weird controllers. Little bits are similar. It's basically connecting your maybe it's the I see. The little bits, yeah, so they're kind of for kids. So they connect them with magnetic connections. They're very expensive, but easy to get started with weird little hardware programs. Everything is cheaper. The Pi Zero, a Raspberry Pi, only costs $4. Arduinos are not much more expensive. They're easier to buy. Like you can buy them from China for a few dollars only. Yeah, there's better hardware. So I'm using the Teensy, which is like a beefed up Arduino, but it's also smaller. So it's kind of a very interesting thing to look at. And there's also Kickstarter devices, which are more specific to each use. So like everyone can make their own integrated hardware, Internet of Things thing now. And there's very little security checking. So, you know, like, I don't know if you heard recently there, all these Philips Hue lamps, they had a security leak where people could hack them from outside the Wi-Fi. So they flew drones outside the windows and hacked the lamps, and so they could access to the entire Wi-Fi through that. So it's like a weird issue with Internet of Things, because then you have to firmware update your lamps, which is a ridiculous concept, but happens. And yes, a lot of communities as well, offline and online. So offline you have hack spaces. I'm part of one in London, which is fairly big, and that's where I learned like laser cutting, 3D printing. I think universities are getting more into this stuff now as well. They have these fab labs, maker labs. But online is also, there's like, especially the Arduino forums are a trove for finding out how stuff is done. So when I make a new project, basically, for example, the rubber band, I just Google, you know, stretch sensor Arduino, and then a page will come up. The first result is, oh yeah, you use this sensor, it costs, you buy it here, it costs $10. You put them up to these pins, and here's some example code. And so you're just basically going with not knowing anything about electronics, really, which is perfect. So once you have all this, or decided to start, the next question is, where do you actually make these games? And there is a few game jams that focus on hardware games. So one of them is the Alt.ctrl game jam. It happened, this is from last year, but there was also one this year. This one is a bit weird because it's online only, which is especially bad because hardware games you can't play online, so nobody can play any of the hardware games really. So it's a bit odd, but it's you see the videos, and then some of the winners usually go on to the Alt.ctrl GDC exhibition, which is in San Francisco, and I'm going to show a picture of that later as well. And then there's other ones. So like Zoom Machines is one in France that was also kind of focused on hardware stuff. But obviously you can make them anywhere. So I usually, all game jams I go to now, I just bring my little box with hardware and then start soldering. So for example, on the train here, you can see down there on the bottom, That's my little hardware kit. And it's a bit more tricky to solder on the train when it moves, but it's definitely possible. It's part of the fun, really. Right, so it is the laptop, I think, that hums. Well, the main game I'm going to talk about now is Line Wobbler, and so this is a game I made a few, 3 years ago now at a game jam, and I have the game here. So I'm going to show it to you first, and then we're going to talk a bit about the details. So the game is actually like in this box. So who of you haven't seen the game yet or don't know what it is really? Show of hands, maybe? Okay, most of you. Good. Okay, so it's a one-dimensional game. So it runs on one line, and this line is an LED strip here. And it's controlled with this joystick, which is inspired by a doorstopper spring, which are like, I don't know if you know them. I'll show you a video later. So let me switch it on. So there you have it. It's basically a one-dimensional. So it's a one-dimensional dungeon crawler. So you control this green light over here, which you can move. Can you hear the sound? I can put it, well, it's fine. And so you have obstacles on the line. So in each level, you're trying to reach the other end of the strip. So it's a fairly simple game in itself. It's just a very unusual presentation. But for example, these red dots are enemies. So if you touch them, you die. And it's like a colorful little death animation. So you can overcome them by flinging the spring. So you do like this, basically. It's kind of hard to play now, lying over there. Yeah. And then once you reach the end, it goes to the next level. Right. And then there's different obstacles. So like this is a conveyor belt, so it pushes you around. So when you stop, you get pushed back. This is like a tutorial level, so basically very easy. There's an enemy up there. And then it plays around with these concepts a bit. So like, oh, let's add more enemies. Okay, so here's a lot of them. So part of the fun of this game is also that you can lay it out in real space. So the architecture of the space, or like this dog, becomes part of the game, because now it's kind of hard to see what's going on behind it. Just play the next level as well, because that's the last new concept of this game. So it's like, this is like a lava field, so when it's bright, you can't touch the lava. So it's kind of, you need to wait for it to go dark, and then you run across really fast, right? And from then on, it just gets harder. So like now the game kind of ramps up the difficulty. There's like a boss fight in the end. So just quickly this one. So there's like enemies coming from both sides now. So you kind of need to run across. But maybe I'll let you play this later. But yeah, so that's the game. So in essence, it's a very simple concept. But both the controller and the display are kind of new. I mean, there has been one-dimensional games before, but not too many. There's a few online examples. I know there's a 1D Wolfenstein, but that really only works because of people knowing the original, and so they have this transfer of information from this original, and then they use the same sounds. So they pick up something, and the pickup sound plays, so, aha, I picked something up. But it's not really inherent in the visuals. So I made this a few years ago. Let me go back here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the inspiration for the game, how it became what it is now. So basically, iteration through exhibitions. So because I showed it at places and it kept breaking, either software side or hardware side, and then I learned from those and went through it. And then what steps I took for it to become more of to show it at places, basically. So how it became installation art. But that's not really part of the object, it's part of where you show it, I think. So yeah, so this is the Exile Game Jam, which is in Denmark, or was in Denmark. It's also not really happening anymore. But there I made this prototype with a friend, Matthias Maschek. And you can see on the slides, it's a 1 meter line. That's what we found there. Basically, during the jam, or like the organizer brought a big pile of stuff to experiment with. And I had the idea for this spring controller before I came to the jam, so I brought the necessary hardware. And the inspiration for this, I got while doing research online, and as everyone does, research online is done by watching cat videos on YouTube. So this is the exact inspiration for the controller. It's a cat playing with a door stopper spring. There's also sound. I can probably just make it really loud on my laptop. You can hear the... This makes this really satisfying sound. It's not my video, not my cat, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately, because apparently the cat does it 5 a.m. every morning. So yeah, let me switch off the sound. So I thought, wow, if the cat can have so much fun playing with a household object, maybe humans can too. So it took me a while to figure out how to actually measure how you bend the spring, right? So I mean, there's several axes of freedom in there. So first I thought bend sensors could work well. So like these little plastic strips, and when you bend them, they change resistance, so you can measure that. But there's like flat strips, so you can't bend them sideways. And in fact, they break when you bend them sideways. So I could, as I say, okay, maybe I restrict it somehow, or maybe I try something else. And it took me a few iterations, basically, or like thinking about the problem. So I thought maybe a joystick in the bottom could work. But in the end, I started using an accelerometer in the top. So this is actually 3D printed. And inside there is an accelerometer. And so basically, it measures acceleration, obviously. But what I actually measure is like the direction of gravity. So I'm basically, when I bend it, the direction of gravity changes, right? So gravity is like this way now, right? So and this is, and you just can measure that with an accelerometer. It's very easy to do, actually. A bit more tricky is kind of removing the acceleration you get when you move it very fast, right? So you don't want it to kind of freak out, because this is an acceleration as well, right? So then you can do that with a gyroscope. And actually the sensor has a gyroscope built in, so that was kind of convenient. And then I used an algorithm that I found on the internet to kind of combine the two. Yeah, so that's kind of how it started. And in the beginning, I used a thing called a shoe tree spring, which is a spring. I don't know if you know these things which you use to keep leather shoes in shape. I don't know, my grandma uses it. So you put this thing in, and there's like a spring in the end, and you bend the spring, and you put it in the shoe, and it kind of stretches the shoe. I mean, like, I actually used my grandma's in, can I go back on here? Let's see, yes. So this thing you see there, yeah, this thing is actually a shoe tree spring. Now, you can't really see it on there. I think there's a picture later where it becomes clearer. But yeah, so I actually stole my grandma's shoe tree and used that. And that obviously, I mean, that is kind of also, you can't really scale up from there. So you can't really, my grandma only had 3 of those. So it's not an infinite supply. But yeah, so what I basically talked about now is like, or the design limitations of this basically informed the game mechanics for the game. So when we made this, when at the jam basically, I had the spring, I had the idea for the spring, so I kind of built my little thing. And then Matthias, my friend there, he tried to do something with the LED strip. And so we said, okay, we're both working with hardware, let's combine the two. And so once I got this thing working for the first time, I said, okay, we're going to put out a debug information of how far I have bent the spring, and it's this like a light dot on this thing. And then I kind of flung the spring like this, and you can see then, oh, it just kind of starts kind of going back and forth really fast, like violently. So if it's violent, it might be an attack. And if it's an attack, we should have enemies. So we put enemies in there, like these red dots, and it's, oh yeah, this is already kind of fun, and it can move back and forth and kill these things. And so what else can you do if you can move only in one direction on a strip? So then it's like, maybe you can't move in one direction, or you get pushed away from that direction. And that's exactly the other 2 elements of the game. So it's like these conveyor belts that push you in a way, or lava where it's kind of it's a timing challenge where you need to wait and then run across. So that's kind of the 3 elements that I have in the game. There's a couple more I was thinking of, like there could be teleporters, there could be pickups, there could be different types of enemies. It's fairly easy to think of these elements, but actually the display is very simple, right? So it's just like a line of colors. So you don't really have any kind of way of conveying additional information. I mean, like you could have different lights in sequence, but there's no textures, there's no text. So actually making the player understand what is going on is very tricky, and especially after I built this and I experimented with more ideas for this hardware, it became very apparent that it's actually tricky to really tell the player, okay, this is you, this is what you have to do. And that's also why the game kept so simple, and also informed the choice of colors. So here, green is good, red is bad, orange is somewhere in between. It's like a traffic light, basically, right? So that's a familiar concept, and that's why it has been chosen in the game. And that's also a reason why I didn't really add more things. Although some people, I mean, like, when people play the game, they say, oh, this is nice, and it worked really well, and I want to play more and harder levels. So maybe it could work well as a new game plus, where you add new elements and make the player explore them by themselves. But for now, it's just these three, and then there's like the final boss. I guess you have to play yourself to see him. He has a new mechanic, but then for boss fights, it's fine if players don't understand what's going on at first. So it's kind of a discovery process. And it's very hard, actually, to beat it, but it's also good. Yeah, I actually spoke about all this already. So we're exploiting the characteristics of the input mechanic. So basically, everything you can do with this spring we use in the game, and it's a very direct mapping. So it's like if you bend forward, you go forward. If you bend backward, you go backward. And then the only other thing you really can do is shaking the controller, and that's also used in the game. Yeah, maybe the last point. So when I started using the accelerometer, I didn't know how good it would be, how accurate. So I thought maybe I can measure forward and backward, and that's it. But it turns out it's actually very accurate. So it's very satisfying, and you get a very precise and analog feedback. So that actually made the game much faster because you can control it in a much better way. So it's much easier to kind of be precise while also being fast in between. So that sped up the game and then basically allowed me to add more difficult elements to the game. So it's more skill focused. All right. Yeah, so we go onwards. Now that we have this LED strip, it is still living in the real world. So then it's embedded in the world. So it actually becomes part of the game depending how you set up the strip. The game has different characteristics. I mean, like it looks different and it feels different to play, even though the game mechanics are the same. So for example, this one was an early show. I showed it in Berlin at the Amaze Festival, which is amazing, by the way, so you should all go. It's the best indie festival in Europe, I think. Happens in April every year. And there I had it actually go over the players' heads, so they actually had to look over and behind them, which is super awkward, but I actually really embrace this awkwardness. So I really like to kind of annoy the player a little, to kind of basically push them out of their comfort zone. And that's also an affordance of these hardware games, is that it's not only a screen and a controller and you sitting in your couch and doing nothing else but staring forward. So having this kind of hardware game, I think you should, or we can, make the player kind of do weird things. So looking up or behind you and kind of getting a stiff neck maybe afterwards is a thing I encourage. So it's like kind of making them uncomfortable a bit. But at the same time, it also looks quite cool from the outside, so people are staring up, and nobody's ever staring up when they play video games. Maybe in VR actually now, so that's kind of a different thing. But it's kind of a nice attractor for the game. So it's kind of it looks attractive for the audience as well. Here's another setup. This was actually at the Zoom Machines festival that I mentioned. That's also where we made the knife game at this festival. Unfortunately, it also doesn't happen anymore. So it was like a small thing in France, in Lille. But yeah, they had this weird metal structure there, and I just kind of appropriated it with my game. So it's kind of nice. It was like a spiral pattern in a way. You can also have it underwater. This is actually at my parents' pond. It was actually, so the controller is over waters, and the LED strips are like in the silicone tube, so it's actually waterproof already. So there's very little work involved, and it doesn't really change the gameplay at all, but it kind of looks cool. And then also we had little newts in the pond, and they were attracted by the lights. There, you see that? That was super cool. So they all kind of came to it, and like I like to imagine them like being really confused and what's going on. So that was fun. Right. Okay. So now to break the game down, basically. So these are the parts that I used. It's not really important. It's just in case you kind of wanna know. So let me just laser point. Okay. So these are the accelerometers here. In real life, they're like very small, like 1 centimeter. They're also coincidentally the cheapest accelerometer that's on the market. They're like $1 or $2. So they're very easy to use. So you have like these connections on the side, and you wire them up basically to connections on the Arduino. So this is the Arduino. Oh yeah, it has like an automatic mode, so now it's going to play automatically. Terribly distracting you from what I'm going to say, but it's fine. Yeah. So maybe it's distracting me more than you, but it's also good. Yeah, here's the springs that I end up using. There are these door stopper springs from the cat video, not the exact one. And then, yeah, there's like these are the LED strips. The LED strips actually that I'm using are fairly expensive. So I think that's the most expensive part in the game. They're about 150 euros each, but they're only so expensive because they're basically the best ones you can get. So they're the most dense. So the LED, like there's 144 LEDs per meter. And if you want less, like 60 or 30, it gets much, much cheaper, also cheaper per LED. So this is just because, because I could. And it looks best when it's, like really dense and long. And normally these strips are not 5 meters long, but only like 1 meter. So I needed to ask the factory for me to kind of solder them together. And you can actually see the solder joints if you want to check it out later. But yeah, so that's the parts. It's actually not that many parts if you think about it. It's like there's only like a few resistors to make some cables work better. And that's it. So it's very digital in a way. So the analog side of the game is mostly the connections from the chips to other chips. So you don't really need to know electronics that well. But yeah, so once you've built it, I showed it at places. So for example, this was in Rome at the Maker Faire. At first I thought, okay, Maker Fairs are kind of these boring events where only nerds go. But it turns out it's full of kids. And they loved the game. But this was also in Rome, so in Italy. I couldn't speak any Italian. They don't speak any English. So there was a 100% communication barrier. So I could try to explain the game and kind of, no, let me show you. This is how you do it. That's the only way I could tell them. But it was also a really good test. One, it was a good stress test because I couldn't really tell them, oh, be careful, please. This is a prototype. And also to see if they figure out what's going on. But kids are naturally curious, so they basically figured it out from the get-go. And they also very good at teaching each other what the game was about. But there was also a point where I said, okay, maybe this game isn't stable enough. So one weakness, the main weakness actually is the spring. So I don't know, there's like this door stopper spring that I'm using. And it turns out it's actually too fragile. So the spring, the wires, the coils are use very thin metal. So it bends easily, but also if you pull on it or you bend it too far, it bends non-elastically. So it stays bent, basically, right? So you overstretch it. And then the cable can get trapped and all kinds of nasty things. So I needed to iterate on the design. So basically, I looked at different springs. So in here, actually, you can see these are these shoe tree springs. So you can see this looks like a front of a shoe, and then you bend the back in. I don't know, it's not really important, but that's the ones I used first. And they had this awkward metal thing, wood thing here, and this one was metal, I think, so some kind of protection. So they were kind of awkward to attach to anything. So I kind of screwed in these wood planks and then used the vise to clamp it to the table. So not really good. And then over here you can see the new ones. So that was the first design. That worked actually fairly well, but then I only had 6. So it was a bit tricky. Then the production was kind of complicated. So I switched over to these door stopper springs, but then it turns out they were not strong enough. So I decided okay, I'm going to make my own springs. And I've never done anything like this. So again, how do you make springs? Okay, it turns out you can go to spring factories and tell them what you want to do. So that's exactly what I did. I found this spring factory in East London that does springs. And not only does it do springs, but it also does only springs for small orders. So the place is called Small Order Springs and Fittings Limited. So it's an entirely, incredibly niche company, but it was perfect. So I told them, oh yeah, I'm making this weird joystick, and yeah, I want to feel different. And they went, what? We make springs for doors and stuff. But finally, I could make them understand. I brought the prototype. You see, like this? I said, and then there's like this whole world of different spring material, like different steels. There's spring steel, which is amazing, but it rusts, or it can rust. So that's kind of annoying. So then they have like stainless steel, which hasn't quite the same properties. And then there's different steel diameters, obviously, and different spring diameters. And the combination of those two depends how fast and how hard the spring moves. So I decided, okay, I'm going to have like a couple prototypes, like different sizes and so on. And then, yeah, they made them for me, and they had this big robot. Let me just this big robot that bends springs, and actually that was the biggest part of the cost, was kind of for them to program that robot. I was basically just putting in numbers, but they said, okay, this costs like 100 euros upfront, and then it's per spring, it's fairly cheap. So it's kind of annoying if you want to make just a small sample of different springs. But then it's about €1 for a spring. But so if you order enough, then you can offset the upfront cost. Anyway, I made a video while these springs were made. So this is actually these springs for line wobbler being made. So this is like this big machine. You can see here is like these kind of knives, and they change the size. So you can see it go down now in a second. A bit smaller. It goes here. So that's the top where the knob sits, and then it knocks them off. Actually makes a fairly satisfying sound, but you can't really. The machine is very loud anyway. Yeah. So yeah, these are my springs. Yeah. So now I suddenly had like 50 of those springs lying around, and so you can see the base was made so it can I can easily mount it. That was like the main problem with these shoe tree springs. And that's also part of the reasons why there's still wood here. It's like it's easier to screw into wood, and it's like a bit more flexible. Like the plastic, the acrylic is actually fairly brittle. But I also want to get rid of, want to have it look more nicer. So that's the next step, will be to figure out a nice unifying design in a way. But yeah, that's one part of the puzzle. Then all these the hex spaces basically that I mentioned. They allow me to make the rest fairly easily. So the box actually here, this is acrylic, and I bought it in a sheet. And it turns out it's very easy to make these boxes. It's basically, you download a plugin for Inkscape or Illustrator or whatever. It's a box maker plugin. And so you just give them the dimensions, and it cuts out the boxes for you. Looks like this. Yeah, 3D printing. I mean, you all know about this. This material is actually a soft material. So it's called Ninja Flex, which is quite nice. So it kind of squeezes. So in the first iteration, people complained that they hurt their knuckles because they would kind of fling it like this and then trying to stop it. And it was fairly hard material, so they kind of always hit themselves, which actually maybe in retrospect not so bad. Actually, looking at the knife game, maybe that's kind of what I want. But then, if small kids, you don't really want to hurt them so much. So, so I use this soft material. But then also on this one, I need to iterate again, because it turns out you can't really clean this stuff because it's very rough on the outside, or a bit rough. So all the sweat and dirt slowly seeps into this thing, and you can't really clean it very well. I think it kind of dissolves with alcohol, so it's not really cleanable very well. And then especially if I have it now on a show somewhere, like a museum comes, we want to show it for 2 years, then it needs to be something else. So I'm looking at injection molding and other production processes. But it's exciting, so I've never done this, so figure out how it works. Also nice in the hack space is you have testers for your game, like this guy. He's the cutest. I actually had to switch off the background light. You see the white, because then it stood out more and the cat would chase it much better. So this is a cat-optimized version. So the next step, actually, what I want to do at one point is I want to put some catnip in the controller, so that one cat plays with the controller and the other cat. So that's the ultimate cat version. And then I have to bring it to Cat Cafe or something. I think that'll be very good. Cool. What's next? Oh yeah. So this is how the first version looked. It's just breadboarded Arduino stuff. So this is the Arduino running here, and then all these wires go to different connections. So I made my own PCBs, my own printed circuit boards. That actually turns out is also fairly easy. The software that everyone uses is a bit arcane. It's fairly old. Some of them are command lines and then some buttons. But it's not so hard. I mean, you can learn it in a day. But that was basically just a convenience for me also going forward. Say, okay, now people request a copy of the game. How long does it take me to make each copy, right? And it doesn't, I mean, like all the LED strip, I just order. But then making this spring and making all the soldering together, it takes a while, right? So then the question is, how can I make this quicker? And all this PCB does is basically just making it easier for me to attach different things. So it's like the speaker here. Actually using the USB port to charge the speaker, because I'm using just these tiny phone speakers that you can buy. Which it turned out they were the easiest and cheapest way to get an amplified speaker in here. Yeah, and this is a connector to the accelerometer. Okay. Yeah, so once I have these, so what's the next step once you have made a thing? So the next step is basically going to show it somewhere, right? I'm going to show you a few different shows that show these alternative controllers. Probably the most important one, or for me the best one, is AllControled EDC. That's part of GDC, the Game Developer Conference in San Francisco. It started running only 4 years ago now, 4 GDCs ago, so 3 years. So this is from their first year, and actually you can see the sliders down here, and also that video you saw earlier was filmed there. So it was just like a collection of 10 tables, and people showed their weird contraptions. And that has been super successful, at least people found it funny or interesting. So this exhibition has been growing for the last 4 years. And also, first time this year, they had a dedicated award for alternative controller games. So there's the IGF, the Independent Games Festival, running at the GDC. That's basically the biggest indie award. And they have a category now for alt-control games. So that's kind of evidence, basically, for these games becoming a bit more noticed, at least. I don't know, I wouldn't say mainstream, but at least people recognize that there's this movement. And I think next year, for the first time, it's also attached with prize money. So you can win $3,000. The deadline for this year's alt-control is in a month, in the 1st of December. So there's still time to make your controller. And they don't need to be kind of finished in any way, or finished, yes, but not really polished. And I don't know if you, some of you I know who filled the comments, they looked at the previous exhibits. And for example, one was just like this cardboard box where you sit in and pretend to be a little child and fly around a spaceship. And you have this, what's it called, a noodle sieve? Like this colander? Yeah. On your head, it has headphones, but it looks like a kid's toy. And then the game itself is also it makes noises when you shoot. It goes pew, 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 pew. So it's really, and then you can actually lean and it moves, but it's just like some aluminum foil on the bottom that closes contacts. So it's very simple, but for me, it was one of the best because it really captured this kind of childhood glee of controlling your own spaceship. And then, they drew with crayon on the cardboard. It was fantastic. But yeah, so that's kind of one of the cool ones I saw. The winner last year was one where it's called Fear Sphere. You have to look it up later, but it's basically inside a big bubble, and you have a torch in your hand, but the torch is also a projector, and it has a gyroscope, so where you project is where you can see. So basically, so it projects the level around you, but then also it knows if you move it, so it's static, basically. But then it's a little horror game where you have to look around you, and it's quite well done because you enter this weird dark dome, and it's cut off from the environment. It's basically like poor man's VR in a way, but it worked really well. But yeah, so these things. Yes, so there is basically from these things, there's a progression onwards to get it into more places. And most of this is from my experience, so I don't know if it's universally true or if that's how people do it. Let me just stop this. So there's basically, you start with very experimental events, and then you go to more mainstream events. So AllControl, I just mentioned. You also saw the Amaze Festival in Berlin. They also really like their experimental controllers. There's a place called Fantastic Arcade. It's in the States. It was just like last week, I think, or maybe this week. I think it's like this weekend, maybe. So if you feel like flying to Austin, you can still watch it. I haven't been myself because actually that was the issue because it's so far away from here and they don't pay for anything. So they say, okay, you can exhibit Line Wobbler, but you need to pay for everything. And it was a bit expensive. This is also a one-day event, and then you fly over, show it, stay in a hotel. So it's like, I don't know, it worked out at 2,000 euros, and that was a bit too much for me. But everyone who went says it's a really cool event, so if you end up being there anyway. And from there on, basically when you've shown it there, or even before, you show it at more normal game shows. And as I said, like this the acceptance of these weird alternative games is becoming more widespread. So curators of events like EGX in the UK, Gamescom in Germany, or elsewhere are aware of these games, and they more readily accept these weird controllers, even they haven't play tested them, because normally you send something in, they need to test it. And it's kind of much harder to do with these hardware games. But yeah, so you can show them there, and people are usually quite keen to try them. From there on, you can go even more general. So you go music and film festivals. So for example, this one was in Romania, in Cluj, the Clujatronic Festival, which is a music festival that also has like weird installations. So that was really cool because they have like this moody lighting and this kind of Berlin-style buildings, like really rough insides, and then they had like electronic music playing at the same time. So it's a really cool festival, and this is getting more popular as well. I mean, this festival I got into through my connections, or like through the Amaze festival, because the Amaze organized this as a pop-up. So I showed it first in Berlin, and then people in Berlin said, okay, this is cool, maybe it could work at a music festival. So they hand-selected a few of those exhibits and showed them at these festivals. Yeah, so, okay. Yes. And finally, then it goes on to museums. Although for me, it has been fairly passive. So actually people, like curators, they go to these events, to these on the top, and they see interesting new exhibitions that they might want to show. And then most of them have contacted me actually saying, hey, we have this exhibition coming up on interactivity, for example, and then say, okay, can we show Line Wobbler? And I say, yeah, sure, I want it in a museum. And then they ask, okay, how much does it cost? And then the next question is, okay, actually, how much do I charge for this to be shown? And I have no idea because I've never done this before. Luckily, one of the first ones that showed it said, okay, we can provide you with a fixed artist fee of 500 euros. I said, oh, sure. And I get it back afterwards. So it's basically like a 500 euro on the hand, and then maybe I have to kind of replace the top because it got dirty or something. But that was a good hook, or basically I knew, okay, this is like 500 euros, that's cool. And then basically when a new exhibition comes along, I quote something like this, or if I don't really know them and don't care so much, I say, okay, now it's 600. And usually then I get an email 2 minutes later, yeah, absolutely no fine, send it over right away. I said, shit, I should have asked for 800 or something. So it's kind of hard to judge these things, and I'm still learning as I go along, and I think it also depends massively on the size of the museum. Like most of the time I've shown it, I showed it, or like people asked, it's like small museums I've never heard of. There's like lots of those kids and childhood museums, and also like general events. So I don't know their budget really, but it's kind of, I guess, learning by doing. So you kind of figure out how much you can charge. And that has become now one of my basically income sources for this game. So this is how I make money from Line Wobbler, is by showing it at different events. And some charge, for some you can get more. Like for indie events, usually don't have any money, so it's kind of, yeah, it's fine. Your friends, or I want to support the movement basically. But then bigger museums have a bit more money, and the two basically that have been most successful for me are actually film-related museums. So film anything seems to have more money than games anything. So it's like it's more established art form, I suppose. So one I've worked with is the Toronto International Film Festival, and they have a kids festival, and the kids festival has a digital exhibition attached to it. And I showed it at the exhibition, and they actually flew me over and hosted me for a week, which was very nice. So if that happened every month, I'd be set. But it's like a one-off affair, right? So you always need to find new ones. But the good thing about this one is they said, oh, actually, we have also a traveling exhibition that we hire out to different museums. So they have a catalog of games, basically, where they have like Line Wobbler in there now, and they said, okay, you can rent this. And they have, so then I get a contract, basically, with them. And they have a fixed artist fee and say, okay, you get $700 each time the game is shown for a 16-week period. So it's like 4 months. And that has been really good because they have shown it at a few places now. And I don't actually even know anymore when they show it. They just get an email, oh, we've shown it at this place. Please send us an invoice for 2 time periods. And I get, oh, yeah, $1,400 more. But obviously it's not as easy now with this because especially the first actually, pretty much all of the exhibitions, usually something goes wrong. So one of the big things was also, like with the spring and all the springs before, what breaks the game, basically, or used to break the game, is if you pull it upwards really strongly, because there's this wire going through the middle, and the spring is flexible, obviously. So if you pull it up, then you just tear the cable apart. So now there's like a little retention wire in here, so you can't really do this anymore. But this used to be a big issue, and then also it depends on how the museum set it up. So like if the cable is like visible like this, kids will at some point definitely pull this apart. Either just if they're nice, they just kind of do it here, but otherwise it just kind of breaks somewhere, and then they say, "Oh yeah, your game is broken again." It's like, ah. And then if it's really annoying, it's like somewhere in China, and you have to kind of FedEx a replacement part over, and it costs like 100 euros, and it's a bit of a nightmare. This, yeah, and then calibration is an issue, but not so bad. Yeah, so there's like a few issues, but then also once you have it in these bigger exhibitions, let me just switch this off for now. It becomes a bit easier. So now, I mean, for me, it was definitely like a weird discovery process where I didn't really plan for any of this to happen. But from now on, I definitely kind of go forward with a bit more of a open eye, basically. So now, okay, this is a thing that works, so maybe I should kind of focus on this. So, and as I showed you earlier, let me just go backwards to this spring thing that I'm building. This one. This has been built, you can actually see that it's like very related to Line Wobbler in a sense. So it's like springs again and LEDs again. So I know both of those concepts or mechanics already, so it was actually fairly easy to get started. And this is also built with modularity in mind. So this is, now it's 36 springs, but you can add basically as many as you like. I mean, at some point I have to think about like, oh, what is the data structure that I send all this spring information back? But right now, my idea is that if a museum comes along and says, oh, we have this like 10-meter wall, and we want it full of springs, then I can say, oh, sure, it's whatever, 5,000 euros per meter. How many you want? I don't know about the prices yet, but we'll find out then next time I come and speak, then I can tell you how much I can charge. But the idea is kind of to have this massive, big-scale thing, and it's kind of targeted at these festivals and museums. More. And then now that I have these contacts, it hopefully is easier for me to tell them and convince them to do it. So yeah, you have the first step in. So it becomes a bit more of a directed way to do these things. All right, so I'm going to show you, I showed it at Burning Man as well, which was very interesting. Apparently the game is really interesting to see when you're under the influence of LSD. People told me. Yeah, that was cool. Also, it would be cool because it was a really good stress test because all this, I don't know how much you know about Burning Man, but the sand at Burning Man is super, what's the word? The opposite of acidic. Basic? I don't know. But it kind of corrodes the metal really fast. So like, everyone had these bicycles to go over the playa, and they kept breaking. It's like the chain would snap and stuff. But luckily, the game survived. I mean, I had to clean it very thoroughly. But that was a cool experience. But they didn't really pay anything. So that was like definitely an excuse to go to some cool event. They paid 500 euros or dollars, but the whole event is so expensive. It was like a drop, basically. Cool. So then the next question is, and this is basically the last topic I'm going to talk about, is where can you take these games if you have one? So like I obviously went the kind of this installation art route, and I think I'm going to keep it as a museum piece. Maybe I'm looking into bars and like bars and arcades more. So arcades seem to make at least a limited comeback. So at least in the States and also now in the UK, there's more bars that kind of focus on like retro arcade bars. Barcade is a thing. So this kind of resurgence of arcades could be used for like this new, if you classify it as a new arcade, basically. So it's like weird games that could work well in this context. So the question is basically, is it installation art or is it a household commodity? Is it like a toy or an art piece? Or is there even a difference? But there's some considerations you need to do when you want to go one way or the other. And for me, for example, it's like, I can justify these high prices because it's all handmade by me, and what would be my, so if I spend 2 days making this thing, In London, you get a day rate as a freelance programmer of like, what, say, £400. So 2 days is already £800 plus the hardware. So you're already looking at more than £1,000 for each copy. And I wouldn't probably spend myself that amount of money for a game that you can play through in 15 minutes. So it's definitely a rough value proposition as if you look at it from a consumer perspective. But for bar, they get pinball machines that are tens of thousands. Well, like I don't know how much they cost actually, but I think 5,000, yeah? $5,000 to $8,000, right? I mean, obviously a pinball machine is much more complex, so it's not quite comparable. But they spend the money, and then suddenly 1,000 is not that much anymore. So then that's the consideration. Like if you don't mass produce it, then it becomes more rare, and it's like a thing for different audience. Yeah, warranty durability is a big question, and I haven't really solved that yet. So if a museum, and I had a few saying, oh, we want to have this as a permanent installation. What do you do about warranty? Do you say to them, oh yes, 1 year, and then it's parts after that? Do I, hand deliver the parts, or what is happening? And another question is like, electrical safety and all this stuff. I haven't actually done any certifications of that sort. So maybe I have to think about this. I don't know. I'm looking to do a big exhibition with another UK museum right now, and hasn't really been announced. But they also ask, what is the I forgot even the word, but they have like some health and safety thing. They need to electrical safety. Because like if the kid bites into this, and it might happen. You never know what will happen to the kid. This is all 5 volts, so it's, I think, perfectly safe. But, that's me telling them, and, my word doesn't really count for much, especially if the lawsuit comes flying in. I don't know. So these things need to be considered, and I haven't really done much research. I mean, it's possible. It's just the question of money and effort. Basically talked about the other things already. Limited edition. So some people actually said, okay, I would buy this even if it's expensive. And I said, okay, sure, because it's you, and they were mostly friends. Then I'm selling one, but also usually below cost, because especially with the construction quality of this thing, it doesn't really justify like whatever 2,000 euros price point. It's just handmade thing. I mean, maybe it does, but for me, it would definitely have it look nicer. And I think if it looks more polished, then it would be easier to justify that. But this is basically, these are questions I'm kind of considering right now. What is going on? How does it need to look for it to be sold as an art piece, basically, right? So more generally, there is different ways. So I just talked to you about the small scale installation art route. Another way is licensing it out. There's arcades and toy companies that look for these things. So actually, I had a talk with Hasbro about this specifically, although we didn't really get far in the discussions. But basically, they're looking for independent inventors to give them new ideas, basically, for things they can sell. But mostly what they are concerned about is their IP. So they want their IP that they bought for expensive money to be applicable to a new toy. So for example, Hasbro, what they showed us there at like this little cocktail event, they brought an R2-D2 Bop It. I don't know if you know Bop It. It's like this weird kids toy where you basically it tells you what to do. Bop it, twist it, turn it, and there's like a twist and a turn, so it's like a rhythm game basically. But they made like an R2-D2 version. So basically they want to brand everything they get to their big IPs because it sells better. It's people buy Minecraft anything, so it's better look like Minecraft. But so that's a tricky thing. And if you're proud of your achievement on your game, and like Line Wobbler is super abstract, so it doesn't really, it's not easy to think about something that could work. Maybe Pac-Man. I actually did talk to Bandai Namco. That was exciting, but they are also very conservative. So they said, we don't really know how this game works. And I think what they meant is like, we're afraid the kids won't understand. And it's kind of difficult to deal with Japanese companies in the first place, because they don't really tell you, no, we don't like it. They say, maybe we could do this. We send you an email about it, and then they never send an email. It's kind of this quiet death. Although they did send an email recently after half a year saying, finally, we can't do it. So that was nice in the end. And they told me actually that they did do some target audience tests. I don't know if it's true, but it could have been. They said, okay, kids between, 8 and 14, they didn't really understand the game in itself. So I think they needed instructions. But adults found it super fun. And so they said, they actually suggested, oh yeah, maybe it could work in a bar environment. But we as a company are focused on the 8 to 14-year-old market especially. So no thanks. So I mean, it's fair enough, and it's also good feedback looking at bars in the future. So yeah, it's a bit tricky to deal with these companies. And in general, what then happens is you hope they don't just rip it off anyway. Because, I mean, this is not patented in any way. Because, first of all, I don't really know about patent law very much. Maybe I should have. I think there's probably courses at the university, about the business school maybe. But also, if you patent a thing, I think you need to have the patent before you show it publicly. Like if you upload a YouTube video, it might already be too late, or you have a limited time where you can do it. And obviously, I don't really know if my experiments are going to be anyway of a success. And the patent costs, what, I don't know, a couple thousand to do worldwide patent. And then you need to enforce it in the first place, right? So if then a Chinese company comes and rips it off, I mean, China, you kind of screwed anyway, because they just don't care. But if it's like somewhere else, you still need to order a lawyer and get it taken down, and it's too expensive. So I just hope no one rips it off, basically. And that hope is there when you talk to Hasbro as well, I think. But I guess these bigger companies, especially European ones, I guess there's some kind of honor there. But then once you have it there, it's also a question of, okay, what happens to it? So usually what I heard, and I don't know if that's true or not, but they license the idea. They don't really care about the implementation because, I mean, this is not mass scale anyway, so they would need to re-implement all the details anyway, so you don't know if they're going to screw it up in the process. If they say, 24 frames a second is plenty instead of 150, what it is now. So, and I think it's part of the charm is that it looks so smooth, and smoother than you can get on a screen. But they might think differently, right? So, and then you get the numbers I heard. I don't know if it depends on your, I guess, argumentation skills. But usually you get like 5% of the sales. So it's very low, but on the plus side, you don't need to do anything, right? So you have the idea, and they do the manufacturing. But you need to get to that stage in the first place, and I don't think that's easy, but that's an option. So that's what some people do. And finally, what you can, I mean, I don't know if there's more, there's definitely more options, but the other thing is you can run a Kickstarter and then mass produce it yourselves. And I have actually friends in London who've done this, and I can show you their game. It's called Beasts of Balance. I have a YouTube video here. I probably need to drag it over. No, wait, does this even work? Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Sound is going to be a bit terrible, but it's not super important anyway. So this is a game you play on your iPad, but it has a scale attached to it, and the scale is connected with Bluetooth. And you have all these pieces you're trying to stack. So it's kind of a mix of Jenga and then kind of evolutionary simulation. So you co-op, you play together, and you stack these pieces, and they kind of make the animals evolve and be different. Yeah, and then if you fail to stack some piece, everything falls down. And then the volcano explodes. So it's actually, quite a nice idea, I think. So some friends made this in London. They actually made this at the same time as I was making line wobblers. So they have the same age. Oh, no. Well, let's play, but yeah. But they went in an entirely different direction. So they made a big Kickstarter successfully, and then went to China, basically. So they found a Chinese factory that works for them. And that's super interesting these days. Like these factories, they do everything in-house, like the electrical parts, the molding, the packaging, the wrapping of the packages, the shipping. It's all done in one big building, I think. It's crazy how integrated this is. And I think that's also what keeps the costs low. And so they sell it for less than 100 euros. And, it's like a lot of parts. So if you hand make it, it's impossible. But it was also a considerable overhead with you need people that enjoy doing all these steps. So I don't really enjoy running Kickstarters, but it's just me, right? So because spamming all your friends and making this campaign, and all friends I've talked to that made a Kickstarter campaign say, so stressful, and you never know if it's going to succeed in the beginning. I mean, if it's ultra successful, I guess you're fine, but if it gets funded in the last few days, then that's like a stress for months straight. But then also on top of it, if we consider Line Wobbler as the object basically, this works in person. So if you see it in person and you play it, you really enjoy it. And that's what the feedback I got as well. A lot of people tell me, oh, okay, this is actually much better than I thought. Or when I saw the video, I said, oh, maybe it's like a funny little thing. But it's actually a good game, which is good with which is what you want to hear. But on the flip side, if you see a Kickstarter video, that's exactly the experience you don't get, right? So you don't really see it in person. You don't feel that it's super fluid and like responsive. So it's a hard sell in the first place, and then also getting the cost down is another issue. So you want to get it below, I don't know, whatever the impulse buy limit is on Kickstarter, maybe $200, I don't know. So that's a whole lot of engineering, and then finding a factory in China that does the spring correctly. So that was a thing I said, okay, I didn't want to do this, and so I went a different way. But it's definitely possible to do this mass production. And I think also now these guys, the Beast of Balance guys, they have their game in the Apple stores, like physical copies, which apparently is like the jackpot, because Apple stores only have like whatever 5 foreign products in their stores, like the drones, and now they have this game as well. So that's, for them, it's good because they make a lot of money from it. But that's also not guaranteed, right? Yeah, so that's kind of the ways you can go with this hardware, and I think that also was actually most of your concerns, saying what can you actually do with these things. But yeah, so I went like this weird art route, and it kind of worked for me, but it's obviously really dependent on the project, and I don't know if I can really generalize what I'm doing, but there is definitely attention there now. People looking at Alt.ctrl games, you can show them at these conventions, and museums are aware of them as well. So like if you want to go this curated exhibition route. So it's definitely a smaller scale than making a digital game, and there's also, on top of the software bugs, you get hardware bugs as well, and that was also kind of a nightmare, figuring out, oh, is the software broken when it freezes, or did some cable come loose? One issue I had for a long time in this game was also like a weird clash, which turned out in the end was a problem with 2 libraries doing the same thing at the same time. It's called a race condition. But basically, it would just freeze after 0 to 20 minutes of the game. So it was entirely unpredictable. And it turned out when I made the cable shorter, it would stop freezing, or it froze later. So I said, okay, we need to make the cable shorter. And nobody understood, because normally, from an electrician's standpoint, it shouldn't make a difference if the cable is 5 centimeters or 20 centimeters. But it did, so it's kind of weird. But it turns out it was a software bug after all. Maybe it was just kind of to do with the timings of the signals. So it was like so precise. And yeah, so like these weird things you run into that are kind of hard to predict. And I solved it finally finding a forum post saying, oh yeah, there was like this weird condition here, and I patched it in this version. And so I tried that version, and now it mostly works. So that's good, but that's kind of these unexpected problems you run into making hardware things. Yeah, so finally, what's next for me? So I still want to keep working on Line Wobbler. I want to make a super large version. That's kind of my dream. So this is a CN tower in Canada, in Toronto. And it has like this interactive screen, or like this display on the side here, going all the way to the top. And I thought, oh, this could be cool. But so we actually started talking to these guys. So my friends at this Toronto International Film Festival exhibition, he knew someone who was in charge of this. So we actually got talking. But then it turns out it's like this super antiquated system where each of those lamps is, first of all, it's what's it? It's not LED, so it's like this old, like a bulb lamp, right? So it's like slow to switch on and off. Not super slow, but it takes maybe a second, right? So it kind of dims after. And also the system they use, they have this big machine, this computer that reads in pictures. So it reads in PNG files and reads them line by line, and that's how it sets the image once a second. So you have 1 frame per second, and you have to get it into this weird picture format. both of which would never work for Line Wobbler because it needs to be fast. Or at least I want it to be fast and responsive and look like very super smooth. So in the end, this is not a way we can do this. But maybe projection is a way to go. So there's all these festivals of light that have projection mapping these days, and I've also been looking into lasers. So laser projection is another thing, especially because Line Wobbler is just a line. So like a laser line would just work fine. You just need to get the colors. And turns out that it's not actually too hard to do. I've been talking to some other artists that have been doing these things. It's just the laser projectors are very expensive, so they're like 10,000 euros plus. So you can't usually afford them yourself. So usually, what happens is they collaborate with this laser company or this show company that has these for these, usually big electronic music festivals or whatever. But yeah, so that's kind of the collaborations need to do. Mutations. So I want to make a multiplayer version out of this. I haven't really figured out what I'm going to do exactly, but co-op could be one way, like versus, like as a race to the top in a way. And there's other ideas I have. And yeah, the new Spring controller, I still haven't given it a name, but that's kind of the new thing. And obviously, I want to make a cool game for it. And I guess it doesn't really need a game. It could just be an interactive installation. I mean, there's like a big overlap there anyway. Is it just interactive, or is it a game? What is a game? Nobody knows. But my aspiration, especially coming from Line Wobbler, because everyone said, oh, this is not just a weird hardware thing, but it's also a good game. And I kind of now have this aspiration, okay, I want this in my new controller as well. But it turns out it's hard. So it's not always easy to find games. And especially my way of working with these things is bottom up. I'm not saying this is the best way, it's just my way. It's like I start with a sensor or the mechanic being like a physical mechanic, like a mechanical thing that I want to incorporate in the game. Like in this one, it was the springs, then it could be force feedback in the sliders, or this, the rubber band is like, oh yeah, this is a cool sensor. And usually I buy these sensors without knowing what I'm going to do with them. So, oh yeah, this is cool. Maybe I can use this later. And then I build the game around it. And that's kind of, it worked out for Line Wobbler beautifully, but it's not always a given that you find this game. That's kind of the danger of doing it that way, but that's what I've been doing. And it's fun to do, like experiment with these weird things that nobody has used before for games. But yeah, so that's what I'm going to do the next few months. I'm going to submit the spring game to Alt.ctrl GDC, so I'm going to be there in March, showing it off, hopefully. So that's kind of my near future. And like the extremely near future, and that's still in progress, and I only started this last week, is making a Christmas tree. I've never shown this picture. I mean, it's like, it doesn't show much, but we're working with Games London, which is like some games ambassador for games made in the UK. And they want to make an interactive Christmas tree for King's Cross Station next month, in December, or like as soon as possible, really. So they talked to this metal company, or like metal, I don't know how it's called, but like they weld stuff together, basically. And they designed, I said, okay, I want to have a spiral. And so they designed this thing. I think it's 8 meters tall, and it's a 30-meter long spiral. Actually, I don't know how long it is. They have to measure it. But then, yeah, so that's kind of an interesting next step. So I mean, like it will have Line Wobbler, or like a version of it. I probably make the background green, to look more Christmassy in a way. So I have to redesign the game a little bit, but it's also nice to scale it up in that way. It's just 30 meters, but already 30 meters turns out is a bit of an issue in terms of signal transfer. So it's like a couple technical issues. And I've never done this, so it's all like a learning experience. But it turns out it's also very easy. It's like, again, you Google Arduino to Arduino, but 20 meters, and then they say, oh yeah, you need to use the RS485 protocol, and there's like these little chips you can use, and you use Ethernet cables to connect the two. And just bought them, and it works. So now I was experimenting with the bandwidth, because I still want it to look very smooth. But if I send all the data through these Arduinos, it's not clear if it's going to be 100 frames or more. But right now I have 70 frames, which is good enough. Actually, it's more than good enough. But then I need to kind of feed in these new signals somewhere in the middle. So I need to figure out, okay, where are they going to be? Are they going to be inside this pole? So I need to drill holes. But yeah, anyway, this is all like really technical things. But I really enjoy thinking about these hardware problems. They're not really problems that I kind of hate to do, but are problems that I kind of, oh yeah, how would you solve this? And it's always something new, and that's what I kind of really enjoy about these hardware games as well. I mean, it's very similar to normal games, I guess, in a way. So like, oh, how would you implement, like soft body physics, for example? I don't know. And then you Google Unity soft body physics, and you find your way there. And it's actually very similar in hardware games that way, that you kind of, oh, how does this work? And solving these problems is very interesting to me, and it's kind of another dimension, basically, of game development. And yeah, so basically, actually, yeah, so the game development side on these games is actually, I think, simpler than making digital games. So like on this one, I mean, you have a player object as well, and it just, did I unplug it somehow? Yeah, well, anyway. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, so the player object is there. It's like just like in Unity, or any game development software, but it only has one dimension of freedom. Like it can go forward and backward, instead of X, Y, Z, for example, in a 3D game. So it's much easier to do collision detection, for example. It's just like, are the numbers the same? So, and then even the particle system I have here. It's like just like 300 little colored units that move in a random direction with a random speed. And so it looks very nice, but it's actually very simple from the software side. Once you've got the hardware going. But then the hardware is just like you use an LED library, and that's it. And then you have an array of colors, and it's all done for you. So it's very nice, but then obviously you have different restraints, like as I was telling you about the colors. So you have different design limitations when you use this weird hardware stuff. Cool. That is actually all I had to say from the talk. So thanks for listening. And yeah, do we have questions, right? So we have still, I don't know, half an hour more. And yeah, well, thanks for first.
Yeah, thank you. So, thank you, Robin, for your lecture and opening up the whole process. That's super interesting. If you have a question, Lassi will bring you the microphone, so you can ask that. Okay, here comes the first.
Okay, hi. Perttu Hämäläinen from Aalto University. I used to do hardware stuff, but that was like late 90s, basically before Arduino, almost before Google. Mm-hmm. And I just grew so frustrated how difficult it was to debug things. Has that changed? How would you compare debugging hardware versus debugging software nowadays?
Right. I mean, so with the Arduino in particular, it's not that much simpler. Basically, what you can do is like when you program them, you connect them with USB. You program it on your computer and upload it, and then the program runs. But you have a serial connection, so you can send strings back and forth. So as you do the debug.log or whatever, that's the same. But more detailed, like compiler breaks is still tricky. I hear you can do it with more advanced hardware than Arduino. So there's like different microchips. Obviously, there's like tons of different ecosystems. So with the more professional versions, you can do this kind of stepping into the code. But I haven't actually experimented with this. So for me, it's all serial strings. And then sometimes you just have to put as many serial prints in there as you can. And then at a certain point, it just stops sending them. And you say, oh, OK, somewhere after this line or between these two prints, it crashes. And then you go. And then it turns out you have the cables loose or something. So it doesn't. But yeah, it's still a bit of a mess. But I don't know if that was the same before the Arduino, but it's still possible, and yeah, I'd say it's not too tricky.
Okay, thanks.
No worries.
Other questions?
Maybe you can think of some in a while, but we can.
I have some questions.
Oh, yeah. All right.
Let's see. I have the notes here. So, okay, I was interested because you've shown it to places where you also see people playing that. So what would be the best reaction or observation or feedback that you've got from the players of these installations?
Right. Yeah, I mean, when you show these things in general, it's always fun to watch the reactions. there's also like this subtle difference of they really enjoy the game or not. I mean, I guess maybe that's the same for digital games, but especially when you have weird hardware, and you can tell kind of if they say, this was nice, and then you go to the next one, it's kind of, okay, maybe it's not that great a game. But you do get like these kind of reactions where they, yeah, this is super cool, and you see the glee in their faces, and it's kind of fun, especially smaller kids. They're fascinated by the lights only, so or already. So I guess it's easier to please them. But no, for me, especially for Line Wobbler, the moment where I knew that it was something more was at GDC, when some of my like game developer idols came along and said, okay, this is actually a good game. It's like, wow, I didn't even know you in person, but you're complimenting this thing. So actually then I thought, okay, this is something maybe I should look into and explore more. And that's why I decided, okay, I do this, I spend a year now pushing this, or like, pushing it to different festivals, seeing where I can take it. And that was like 2.5 years ago, so I'm still doing it. So that obviously was a good decision, or I don't know if obviously, but it was a good decision for me. Yeah, so that's kind of the best way to figure out if the audience likes it. I mean, so you just show it, and then also you can tell where they stop playing, where they get frustrated, and that's kind of, usually I'm very hands-off, so I just let them play and kind of make notes in my phone without talking to them at all. But it depends on the game, right? If it's more complicated, if the game has more input, then you need to talk to them, explain it a little bit, and then you get more direct feedback as well. But it's often a nice discovery process, for sure.
Are you able to use them for further design ideas when you see people using your hardware installations?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first you see what goes wrong, right? So you say, okay, I need to like make the lava slower, for example. That was like one. It's like once you make a game, you get so good at it, it gets very hard to make fair levels. I guess it's the same for any kind of game, but usually when I make a new game, it's way too hard, and then I need to tone it down over several exhibitions until people, don't throw up their hands in frustration anymore. And yeah, so it's. But it also gives me new ideas, like mostly watching what people do, and I have like a text file full of ideas for this game, but also going forward, or what other things could I do with this? And people sometimes they come also, wouldn't it be cool to have like a racing game, like a 1D racing game, like I don't know this, I don't know if you had it here, like it's the Scalextric or Carrera tracks. There used to be these little. Car racing games. We usually had them around Christmas, and it's like these black tracks you connect together, and then you have like this one button control, and you speed up the car, and it flies out in the corner. And it's basically a one-dimensional track. I mean, like the flying out is a bit tricky, but you can think of something. So that kind of gets, oh yeah, maybe this could be cool. And like, how would you make the controller? And then you start thinking, and also because you have already this embedding where you can lay out this strip, and that could be the track. And then yeah, my brain gets going, like how would you encode the corners, because this script doesn't really know where it's laid out, right? So, but there's solutions for all these things. So it's kind of interesting to see people play and to listen to their feedback. I mean, yeah, it's just very bland advice, really, but yeah, it's been successful for me.
Other questions from the audience here?
I have one.
Lasse has one, okay.
I was wondering, like, how much space is there in hardware games? Like, how many people could do what you're doing? Like, is there a lot of museums looking for these things, or is it like, how limited is it?
It is a good question. I mean, like, there is, from what I've seen, there isn't really that many like organized kind of clubs or scenes in cities that especially focus on hardware games. So usually it's like people doing their own thing. So it basically starts with hobbyist things, but then there's like also. I think at Disney has a research division that made a stitching game once. Like they had a programmable sewing machine, and so they would sew the path the player takes onto a sheet, onto a tissue, basically, or like some kind of cloth. And then you could take the game home after you played it. I mean, obviously, it's kind of, each game is like a bit expensive, but that was a kind of a cool thing. So some companies do it. Some like university projects are there, and then usually it's individuals, but it's definitely not where I would call it's a market, right? So there's like, it's very much a niche, and I'm kind of exploring the niche. But then obviously, like I explained, like there is this whole toy sector, where you, like board games, for example, go into this. Like there's analog board games, but there are also, some of them cross this boundary of going into digital, where they have narration tracks, for example, or parts that are on the computer. And that is very close to what I'm doing. There's no real separation there. And obviously board games, they're thriving now more than ever, and they're pretty much the only thing that is still lucrative on Kickstarter. Like games, digital games have dropped off a little bit. I mean, there's still successful ones, but the hype is over at least. But board games are going strong, and I think there's like a strong upward trend. So there's space there, definitely, I think. Yeah. But it's also like the question is then the mass production again. But yeah, I think you have a comment there.
Okay, thanks.
Just a comment for those who want to get into this space. There's a market and probably some others. So I personally know the family entertainment centers, amusement parks, indoor sports centers like Superpark, Dudsons Park in Finland. That's been growing like hell. That's, I think 2 years ago there wasn't practically any of those, but now there's a whole chain of super parks and Dudson parks. And for example, the augmented climbing wall that was originally developed here at Aalto, the company is now 1 year old and it sold more than €1 million for the first year. So I think that's one example of a market for these things, in this case for the sports-focused things.
Yeah. And I guess that might extend to VR as well, although it's kind of, at least in Japan, I've seen a lot of arcades that were entirely focused on VR, so it's kind of a weird atmosphere going in there, but it's definitely, there's a sector, especially I heard in China, is where companies only do VR games for arcades, and you never hear about them because it's also not a mass market, but there's like this whole weird subgenre of arcade VR games. And I think that might be growing as well, especially if VR stays as expensive or people don't want it in their homes. But yeah, that's kind of another open question, what will happen to VR. But there could be an overlap as well, like you have maybe physical guns or maybe something nicer, but where VR enhances the experience of the custom controller. So I could see definitely an overlap there. And I have ideas as well, like I wanted to make a dog leash controller where you play maybe in VR and then you have a fairly strong motor, maybe as strong as I can get, that pulls on the rope, so it's like a rope pulling thing. Ideally, it's stronger than the human can pull, so you can, it's like a back and forth, and then the VR shows like this little dog that kind of pulls on the string. I don't know. So that could be very cool, and it's I mean it's also super niche, and I don't know, maybe it could work in an arcade actually, but there's like definitely weird overlaps there.
Yeah, I would like to comment on that too. We've done research on the area of hybrid games, and I think the word is nowadays phygital, so physical and digital.
Very good.
And that is used by, I think that sometimes when we are looking at the trends of a game industry, we're just looking at the game industry, but there are several kind of contributing trends. And for instance, toy industry is much more eager to innovate on the phygital area because they know the mass production of the material things. And then the game industry people, because they just don't want to do that area because they don't know about that. So there's more reluctance to look at that thing because it's super convenient not to have the material side of it. But there is a lot of like trends that point to direction of different kinds of hybrids and new places for play. And it's just left for us to see what happens and what kind of things we want to experience later in this area and what kind of takes off and what doesn't. So niche is not always bad and the numbers are not always the same, so it's not necessarily that there isn't money if there isn't like millions of players. The business models, they are different. Yeah. Like what you are exploring with the art scene and the customer is museums or festivals and so on and so forth. So that's an interesting area to also look at, and that's why we also invited Robin here to talk about the trend, because it's not just these devices that we are playing with, but it is new spaces for play as well. And this is one of those things. But I would like to also ask from Robin then, how do you, if you want to if somebody here wants to start, haven't done anything yet, so what would be the good starting point to explore the kind of indie hardware area, or the kind of experimental hardware?
Well, I mean, so in terms of hardware, I think the Arduino is the way to go to start. There is a lot of beginner kits out there, which like have all the little bits and pieces, like some motors, some LEDs. So it's good to get you acquainted with what you can do. There's also communities that serve that need. So there's Arduino work groups or tutorials, both offline and online. So if you have a hackspace in your area, or like a makerspace, or even at the university, I think, there's Arduino groups and like intros. So that's one way to do it. And another is like just, well, I guess once you know like the rough outline of this, I think it's important to have a kind of a nice small idea that you want to do, and then go from there. But I mean, that's true for everything. So like, if you work, towards like a small experimental thing, it doesn't even need to be a game at all, or a good game. Just saying, I want to move, like this hammer, and the hammer should press a button for me, or should press the display, so I want to make an automatic Mario player or whatever. Then you're like, okay, I have these servos, and turns out they're very easy to use from the software side. You just give them an angle, like say, move 90 degrees, and it goes, bzz, and that's it, right? So it's actually the entry level is fairly low once you have the pieces in your hand.
Was there in Nordic Game Jam, there was a workshop before the jam or something like that? Somebody was running a workshop.
Yes, so like in a lot of festivals actually now, there is like, there's different festivals. One is called Burn the Keyboard, where you you reappropriate parts of the computer. So you use either the keyboard buttons for something that they're not used to, or like you just take the, solder the wires to what was the button, and then put it, it's like on your head or something, and you like suddenly your head becomes a button, and then already it's kind of a cool game where you're trying to press other people's heads, and you have like a game mechanic right there, and it's actually very little hardware that is required that you need to do. But then there's like often with especially the more unconventional game jams, or like I guess many now have this workshop sessions before, and usually they always have a hardware section now. So that's one way to do it. I mean, like a game jam setting is fairly limited in terms of time, so it might be a bit daunting, but especially if you collaborate with people who want to do it as well, I think it's a cool environment to learn these things.
There is a question. I'm going to give my mic.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be interested in leading like a workshop or something on these?
Yeah, I heard you. Yeah, I mean, like I've done a few workshops on this. It does require some preparation. Like, so you want to have hardware in each person's hands, and ideally also some kind of. So I've seen a lot of workshops that have like cardboard stuff, or like this aluminum foil is very good because you can make contacts easily. It's possible, yeah. I mean, probably not this time around. Looks like I'm only here till 2 days ago, in 2 days. Yeah.
Not this trip, but maybe we'll invite Robin back.
Yeah, well, if there's demand, you need to tell the university, and then they can hopefully invite me over. Happy to come back.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I have a last one. I'm very interested to hear that you had the cat optimization of the line wobbler, but as you were thinking that the customer could be like bars, so can you please tell us what would perhaps be the bar optimization of the line wobbler?
All right.
Was it already bar optimized?
No, that's a good question. I mean, like, obviously, there has like several things you need to consider. One is the drunk, angry customer, especially if you have this game, like say in a corner of the bar, maybe not right next to the bar, the bartender can't see you, and then there's this extremely drunk person, angry that his friend left him, I don't know. And then, he sees his game and takes his anger out. So like it needs to be extremely sturdy, I think. It's like, I think that's why, pinball machines have the tilt and then nothing works anymore. So it's like, don't encourage it. So, and then, you need to think about the same thing with this. And so, I mean, like, I guess it's like kind of sturdy enough now, but then there's like other things like, you can maybe twist this thing off or pull on the LED strip. And so this is a hard problem. Beer spills, same thing, really. But then also, what's the model, the monetization model? Like often they are coin operated, so I would need to do a coin op version.
which is technically easy. So like there's these things you can buy. It's like coin op slots. You just decide, should it just accept 50 cents and then it's cheap, or should it accept any and give change and then it's expensive? But that's like very easy to wire up to these electronically. But then also from the game mechanics, you need to kind of consider, are people willing enough to spend money before they even play it? How can you limit their playtime? Because like you don't want them to play forever, I guess, if it costs money. So there should be a limit. So either time or lives. Right now it's like infinite lives. I mean, it's not hard to add, but then you need to think about, okay, how do I display to the player that it has limited lives? How do I explain to the player the rules? Because people don't read rules usually. So maybe it needs to have an additional display, or can I get away without one? So there's like additional experimentation that you need to do. But I have some friends, there's some bars in London, for example. The Loading Bar is one example. And they're good friends. So I think I should just put it there and see what breaks first, basically, or how players behave, and go from there. So it's a very experimental process as well. But they would, for example, they say, okay, we could do a revenue share, 50-50. So I need to have a coin-operated thing, and then what is the price? What will the game look like? Where will it be? So it's kind of, they're all interesting questions. So it's kind of the open questions, and it's kind of, need to do social experiments, like sit it in the corner, and I don't know, can you make it more expensive after you had it there, or will people complain? So that's another issue. But that's kind of interesting optimizations to do there, yeah.
I have a suggestion what to do in a bar.
Okay.
Maybe if you have like a portal for the beer, so that there is an RFID tag on the bottom of the glass.
Oh, okay.
And you get one play per each drink. Oh. I don't know.
That's pretty good, yeah. Yeah, I can see that working.
So maybe the bar owner would like that too.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I think that our time is done. We are a little bit early. But next what we can do is that we have coffee set on the corridor there. And Robin will join us, so you can ask more questions in person. And maybe also we can set up the line wobbler there, if it works. Yep, it works. So thank you, everybody, also online. And please come back next week. We have a new topic then, and it's about influencers, so YouTubers and streamers, and how to use them in your game marketing. So yeah, thank you, everybody. Okay.
You want to do the raffle now?